emergency, so we wanted pretty much as far away from finance maybe as possible. Although I think it has some behavioral economics things very much in it. So I wanted to, but it was being recorded, and I was afraid for copyright purposes. I was going to start off with the Who, playing "Who Are You" in the background. I was going to, but instead I just put the lyrics. I didn't want to get like sued or anything. So I think who we define ourselves on is super important. And so I'd like you to take a second and literally think about who you are. Think about like how you define yourself. Are you an academic? Are you smart? Are you stupid? Are you whatever? I don't know how you want to define yourself, but think about it. But be super careful. Like I've done this experiment once in class, and I think, and I'm going to throw St. Bonaventure under the bus. St. Bonaventure students tend to think, wow, we're partiers. And I'm afraid that if they think I'm a party, I came to St. Bonaventure for the party, their behavior is going to be vastly different than if I came to learn the education. Because the story we tell ourselves, and this is something we see all the time in behavioral finance, is that the story we tell ourselves matters, and it influences a lot that we do. I'm going to tell you one quick story. The reason Bond Response got started, the entirety of it, the very start of it was when I was, growing up, I always read. I read everything. And any part in time of history that I like to read about, it was pre-Civil War America. And I always asked myself the same question. Am I a good person? Would I have done the right thing? Would I have been an abolitionist? Would I have been able to give up possibly all of my friends, everything, wealth, whatever, to stay and say, you know what, that is wrong. I'm going to stand by and do that, the right thing, even if no one else liked it. And I always wondered if I would have done that. And then Hurricane Katrina came along, and we saw that basically playing out when the people were trying to leave New Orleans and they were being told at gunpoint to go back. We don't want them, and we don't want those people out of the city. And I said, okay, if I don't do it now, I suddenly have the answer. I wouldn't have done it then. So I said, okay, we've got to go. We're doing something at that point. So the story we tell ourselves, and there's many cases in behavioral finance we could talk about. So that said, many people tell themselves they self-identify as hikers. And I think this story comes about as a result of hiking. One thing that is super big in the last, I will say 8 years, but then it just went off the charts completely during COVID, is with post-trail, and I'm going to use it in quotes, depression. This just comes from Nomad Hiker, but they're all about the same. This is the experience that many thru hikers have once they finish the trail. And I should probably take a quick time out and say, Joe, what is a thru hiker?
A person who does a trail from start to finish.
And how long a trail? If I go out and do Bob's Woods, which is like maybe 3 miles.
It's your hike, but we generally think it's like the AT, the Pacific Coast.
So we're talking thousands of miles.
Maybe the Colorado Trail would count.
Okay, so thousands of miles that take months and months and months. 3 to 5 months, usually at a minimum. And during this time, they build friendships, they have trail communities and trail families, and a lot happens. And then when they come back into the real world, it's like, ugh, I can't stand this. There's tons and tons. There's videos all over the place, hundreds and hundreds of videos on, coming back, opening up about post-trail depression, a life after the PCT, how the Appalachian Trail ruined my life, on and on and on and on. Makes it sound like you really want to go, right? And then, again, there's tons of blog articles, psychology articles, post-trail depression, thru hikers, what you need to know. This one, I don't know why I cut it out, but post-trail depression, again, I mean, there's just so many. I could literally go on for days just hitting page down. Which brings us to Backpacker Radio. Backpacker Radio is a podcast. I highly recommend it, even if you're not a hiker. It's really interesting stuff. And back in 2020, they had Ann Baker on. Ann Baker is a neuroscientist at Duke University, and also, in this context, a very big hiker. She's hiked lots of, she lived out in Wyoming for most of her life. I mean, she's enormously popular in the hiking space. And, like if you need to know what type of whatever tent, she's the person to go to. She writes on all that stuff. And oh, by the way, she's a psychologist. So what she had done in 2019, actually, in 2019, she talked about, in 2020, she did the podcast, was talking about this post-trail depression. And first off, she came down very strongly, throw out the word depression. Depression is a word that we use because we don't know better. Depression is, scientifically, it is not that. Really what we are talking about is grief. We can talk about grief as much shorter term. Grief is a feeling of a loss. And I think this from Very Well does a great job. So grief, you're more irritable, you have deep sadness, no doubt. You have difficulty practicing an acceptance of whatever you are. On the other hand, over here, I'm just not worth it. Right? When someone finishes a hike, it's not like they're not worth happiness. It's just that they're not happy right now. So there is, a lot of the stuff looks similar, but I think, and I completely agree that we're talking grief here. So grief of a loss, which begs the question, which was lost? So there's three things that come to mind immediately that were lost. The perception of the self, like who you are on the hike is vastly different than who you are here. And we all have multiple, we act differently in class than we do at home, right? Types of things like that. But when you are on a hike, that's the only way you act. In fact, Dr. Baker calls herself Scrappy. And in the podcast, she goes back and forth with, well, I really miss Scrappy. Like, wait, you're the same person. But she misses the idea that, she's among equals. She doesn't have people asking her questions. And then the congruence of the story in your life. So I think everyone, and this is really, really true, I think, on the student side, they want to do something, and I think we all do, right? We want to make a change for the world. We want to do something to make the world better. And then we sit in a cubicle or we go to faculty meetings and we do all of these things that, like, how is this possibly making anything better? And so her model, which she talks a lot about, is called SPACE. And she said, what people are missing from the trail is simplicity. You know what you're going to do every day. You get up and you walk. That's it, right? You don't have lots of choices. You don't have to do a juggling. Well, which section am I going to go to? You walk. Purpose. You know what you're going to do all day. You know basically what you're going to do. And then I think also important, it's measurable. I covered X number of miles, or I did something. When we are teaching, and and I think teaching is great, I love it, but let's admit it, like there are times we have no idea if I say something today in class, if it has any impact on anyone that day, or maybe in their whole life. I hope it does. I try to remain confident that it does, but let's be honest, I don't know. Like I just have no clue. Yeah, I was gonna tell a quick story about, I tell people to be good and good, all right, and then you hear about someone being arrested for a Ponzi scheme or something, and you go, well, there it goes. I guess I did nothing. But anyways.
Oh, yeah, we know people like that.
We do, yeah. So you hope it doesn't happen, and you hope you did the right stuff, but you just never, ever know. You know when you walk how far you get. It's easy. Adventure, you're always seeing new sights and sounds and places. An enormous one is community. You have community of other hikers, your trail family, you have trail angels. Trail angels who are people who just come up and leave food for you and just give you stuff. Like, and I'm guessing most of us don't have this happen every day. When was the last time someone walked up and just said, here, I would like to give you a lasagna dinner? Like, it doesn't happen very often, right? And then finally, exercise, which really gets into endorphins and how we feel better about ourselves. Endorphins are just a natural opioid. So when we get back from the hike, we lose all of this stuff. And it was, in the ESPN language, an instant classic. It was amazing. I listened to this. I remember I was out running, actually. I was over by the trailer, which you can look at the Boundary Spas trailer over there. And instantly, like I texted every single Boundary Spas leader for the last 5 years. I mean, you've got to listen to this. It's on hiking. Don't worry about the hike part. It is really about Boundary Spas trips. Because every time we get back from a trip, everyone feels like that. It's like, do I really have to go back to class? Do I really have to do it? And it's just this awfulness. And I left out the person's name because I didn't think I should be naming a student, but there was once a student who I had to literally talk to her and her mom at the airport. She was crying for all she was worth because she did not want to come back from the disaster area. She wanted to drop out of school, stay down there and keep working. I mean, that's how, whatever you want to call it, community oriented at the time she was. So let's just quickly go through these. S is for simple. We do one thing at a time, and it's relatively easy. You either help people on a hike, you either hike or you help people if you are, going out on a mission trip, service trip. You're not worried about schedules. I don't care. Like if you hike a little longer, it's dark, you turn on your light. If you're, at a bond response project, if we don't get done with the ramp by 5 o'clock, well, we'll get done by 6 o'clock. We're there until we're done. We're not leaving. We don't have to juggle things. You don't have to worry about anything. Most of the time, and someone earlier was talking about on the online one, was talking about, not having your phones. And I do have to self-report here. On that, he said the average person looks at his phone like 4 hours a day. It's Sunday tomorrow, and I'll get a report, and it's always over 10. So anyways, we don't need to worry about any of that stuff. We're focused. We're in the flow, however you want to talk about it. And we can measure, like right now, we know that we got a ramp done, or we helped someone tear down their room or their house or whatever. A is for adventure, hiking or trips. We go places. And I think this is one of the reasons people like to go places. And one reason why it's so much more difficult to get volunteers for projects here. If we are doing the exact same thing, we're building a wheelchair ramp here, or we're building a wheelchair ramp in Louisiana, everyone, let me go to Louisiana, or Haiti, or Bahamas, or whatever. They don't want to do one on Front Street, which is Olean. Like, that's just a boring trip. No one wants to do that. Next one, purpose. We have agreed upon purpose. We're either going to hike to the end of the trail, or we're going to, make the world a better place, solve some problem, etc. C is for community, and there is no letter that is more important than this. I write a little letter every week from a store newspaper, and every single the conclusion of my most recent one was community. In the end of the day, is all that matters. If you go to, let's go Bonaventure basketball, right? You were there. The NIT, we lost, but was that
The endorphins were running.
Yeah, it was a community fest. It was just like everyone, for whatever year they graduated. Oh, Bonnie, you remember? It was just community is it, and it drives so much, and we have lost so much in the community space. So we do everything together on service trips. We have a tight bond. We sleep together, we talk together, we eat together, the whole everything. And then we also get local communities, much like the Trail Angels. We regularly get people coming up and saying, hey, you guys, I saw you guys out here. Do you want a pizza? Do you want anything? And I bet you at least half the time, and we could be literally working in Haiti where people have nothing, and they're still coming up and giving us food. It is an amazing feeling to get that. So that's some of the stuff. We stick together afterwards. E is for exercise endorphins. Whether it's on a hike or whether it's from working all day, you get the same idea. With one addition, oxytocin. Oxytocin is, you probably have heard Paul Zak talked about it a lot. It's they call it the trust hormone or the love hormone or whatever. It comes together, it builds trust between people. So if you have oxytocin, you suddenly start trusting everyone more. One way to get that is to help people. So both Dr. Baker and myself both hypothesized here. We don't know this. I actually have texted with her about this idea that it would be really cool. The next step is to actually test if oxytocin levels do drop, like if we can recreate this. We can definitely do it in endorphins. I don't know an oxytocin, but I think it's the same exact idea. So when we come back from a trip, there's this rebound, you were super high and you crash. And that leads to things. And there's already been some work, just so you don't think I'm totally out of the blue. Postpartum depression, a little like it, right? You make the persona of I am pregnant, and then you're not. And what they've shown is that the people with more, again, it's preliminary data. I think 8 of the 12 studies I've looked at, or 8 of the 12 have said yes so far. If they had higher levels of oxytocin, they had worse levels of postpartum depression afterwards. So again, 8 out of 12, not statistically significant, but at least it's possible and one thing for future research, hopefully. Yeah, 5 minutes, okay, perfect. So how do we reduce this? We talk about it in advance. We say, listen, you are probably going to have this problem when you come back. We explain what you're doing. You're losing self. And we want to define that so that they're losing it, but they're not. Like, there are alternatives. You're not going to lose your friends. You're still going to stick together. You're going to have friends when you get back. You can still do things. I mean, whether it's a hike, hey, you don't need to hike 1,000 miles. You can hike 3 miles. And you can enjoy a lot of the same. You just have to remember that you're not hiking 1,000 and don't constantly compare. Like, well, today, right, literally as I've been doing this, I had a team out and they dropped off the next wheelchair ramp we were doing, they cut some trees. It lasted about 2.5, 3 hours. That idea was vastly different. They went into it knowing it was 3 hours. They came, they got their, if you want to call it their hit, their perception of who they are, helping people. And then they go on. It has to fit into the bigger part of the rest of their life. So talk about it in advance, we always said. And maybe plan another trip. Get on, look at where else you can go. I know personally, when my first couple trips, when we were doing these, when Bonnie's Fun started, we went maybe once a semester-ish. And I always felt awful when we got back. Now it's part of a bigger picture. And when we get back, next week we would be doing something anyways. So you don't feel that total loss. So this was the original plan. We were going to end right here. And we, step 1, introduce the issue, space model, discuss the space model, and discuss how trip leaders and hikers can use this to reduce their grief. That is what we've done, up to there. All of a sudden, I started asking people, I put it on social media, et cetera, hey, do you have any ideas about this? And I was getting inundated with other people saying they were feeling the same thing, going through other aspects. From retirees, my whole perception of me was that I was a professor and I'm no longer a professor. Or I was a fireman and I'm no longer a fireman. Or graduates, like when I graduated from school, I didn't know what to do. I thought of myself as a student for my entire life, and then suddenly I'm not. Mothers and newborns, this was a fascinating one. A former student texted me, she gave up her job because she wanted to be home to help with her child, and she doesn't feel like she's important anymore because she had perceived herself as this professional woman working. Empty nesters. I had a deli employee this week who told me that she can only work in the deli because she's a deli, she's not a store worker. Her mental image of herself is a deli worker. A super important one, just because a lot of us in the student class in here right now may know it. I had a current student, who told me that he felt very, very different because his entire life, he was an athlete, he was really healthy, and all of a sudden he's not. And he's had to not be able to take classes this semester, et cetera. That idea of who we are and we lose that perception is everywhere. The most striking example of it is with veterans. Veterans have an enormous problem when they leave, especially on deployment. We've been working with Frank Morales on this, who has done this, and we have lots and lots of stuff on that. So, the Enter St. Francis of Assisi and Joe Coate, they're almost one and the same. So, he pointed out that Franciscan life, especially early Franciscan life, had many of these same things. Simplicity, they didn't get fancy, they all wore the same uniform so that they could fit into this community. The purpose was simple, the adventure, and this actually came up in one earlier today, they said they were always on the move, and even the women, the cleric group, their sites were always on busy roads so that they were constantly, getting new adventures happening to them. Community sharing idea. And E, which I don't really know yet, work. I'm still working on that one. I'm not sure effort work. I'm not convinced that's the right way to go. So we'd like to bring in some more evidence from Francis of this, especially on self-perception. And if anyone has any ideas, please holler or text. Probably easier. So, did I make it?
Yeah, you made it 5 minutes. Yeah, so
5 minutes.
If anybody's got questions,
I
Grace,
just
you
want
may
to
call
share,
them, so.
you mentioned Katrina, and our late brother Ed Codwood shared in one of his workshops for new faculty, compassion can be caught, taught, or learned. And he used the example of Katrina. You mentioned there was a gentleman, they were working in his house. He had lost everything down in Katrina. He had like $5 left in his pocket. Went down and bought a sub, cut it up in little pieces. So all the students that were there could get something to eat. And Ed shared at that moment, those students finally got it, what it was all about. So
Yeah, and it happens regular. Like I bet you, at least locally, at least 75% of the time, if we're at a house that, and some, like I'll be admit, sometimes you don't want to eat it. Like they're coming out, the house is filthy and everything, and they come out with something, and I go, oh, thank you. Polly, what's some food? But yeah, I mean, it's completely that, and so many examples. Yeah.
I gotta say, until you actually do something like this, it's almost, the high is almost impossible to describe. I mean, when you're there for, like we did the Bahamas, we would be there for 10 to 12 days. And it was the most intense thing because you had 50, 60 kids that were busting their ass day in and day night. They were everybody's having fun, and you're right, everything was there. And it was really, when you came back, I gotta say, one of the worst things about COVID, the fact that I couldn't do that.
Yeah.
And I could feel it was like a hole in my heart. But we used to do the same thing about the students before COVID. Students would call it the Bahamas hangover. So you would come back.
Well, they had two kind of.
Yeah, they did. They would come back, and it was just like, they basically, it was just, we had to come up with new tools and mechanisms.
We did,
To
completely.
work around the fact that we knew people would basically, it was hard to get them involved again too. It was a weird thing. Few people would, but over time we figured out that it was tough.
but I think what was cool that what you came up with was when we did the collaboration with the schools and Lauren Stuff and some others would come down. And so then when they came back, they had to then work in the school systems here
Yeah.
to like, so I'm saying it was kind of like, at least it was like a carryover. So what did you learn? How are you gonna take it back?
But it took a while to figure that one out though.
Jim, if I ask you, so based on you have many hats,
Yeah.
that's who you are.
Yeah.
How you define yourself.
You're gonna laugh. The first thing I've asked that question myself before. I always athlete at some point. Is that some sort of my first one? And then second one is someone who's just trying to make the place better, the world better. And it doesn't, so a helper, I guess. And it doesn't matter. I think all my hats are very similar. They don't necessarily seem it, but to like running a grocery store is giving people jobs. It's helping people eat better. It's helping. It's literally in the write-up when we were talking about, doing this, one of the things I said was, how do you value a job? How do you value it? It literally, a sentence I remember, I still have in my initial notes was, this is just Bonnie Spons in a different hat. And I really do think that it's just a different hat. So, all right.
Question?
Hi everyone, I'm Gracie. I'm a junior marketing major here at St. Bonaventure. We have Peter Blair here for our last speaker of the day. He's here from Harvard, and he's going to be talking about digital labor markets. So take it away.
How much time do I have?
You have 20 minutes and then 5 minutes for questions.
I guess so. All right, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you so much. It's a huge pleasure to be here at St. Bonnie's. The trip has been phenomenal. Thank you to the dean, to the organizers from the Foster Center, and to all of you who are here, the student organizers as well. And a special shout out to Bobby and to Ben, who are part of the reasons why I'm here. They were two of my first PhD students when I was on the faculty at Clemson University before I moved to Harvard, and they're doing such a phenomenal job. It's great to see the community that they've created. The paper that I'm going to talk to you today is, does occupational licensing reduce the effectiveness of customer search on digital platforms? And this is work that's joint with my collaborator, Misha Fisher, who's the chief economist at Angie. And just to put this in context, I have a series of papers that looks at licensing. Bobby and I have 3 papers? Bobby and I have 3 papers on licensing. And in fact, in today's New York Times, there's a write-up on this paper and also the work that Bobby and I have done too. So if you want to get some more details into that work, please check out today's New York Times. I want to first start off by giving you an introduction into occupational licensing. How many of you in here have heard of the term before? Who has not heard of that term before? All right, great. So according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a license is a labor market credential that's issued by a government agency that allows an individual to lawfully work for pay. So if your occupation is licensed and you don't have a license, you can't work for pay legally. This is an incredibly important labor market institution. 1 in 5 Americans are required to have a license to work. 1 in 5. The numbers look pretty similar in Europe. And as you can see on this figure on the right-hand side here, over the past 5 decades, the instance of licensing in the United States has climbed from about 5% to 25%. So this is an incredibly important labor market institution. By comparison, only 11% of Americans are unionized, but we don't know as much about licensing. The fundamental economic trade-off in licensing is that if you license a profession and impose some standards, you could potentially have better service quality providers in that occupation, but by increasing the barriers to entry to that occupation, you're going to reduce the labor supply, and that's going to increase prices. And so that's going to be the fundamental trade-off. From a policy standpoint, and we heard earlier today about politics and economics and markets, this has been one of the rare issues where there's bipartisan support. So everyone from President Obama to President Trump to President Biden have said we need to reform occupational licensing in the United States. And so this is why it's really important for us to think about what is the evidence that's going to shape the way that we understand the trade-offs that are inherent in this policy discussion. In this paper, we're going to focus on the intersection of occupational licensing and digital labor markets. And I know that thinking about the online sector is something that's important to this year's iteration of the conference. And the reason why we want to do that is because the fundamental idea behind digital labor market platforms is that they're supposed to improve economic efficiency by making it much easier for customers and for service providers to match. Occupational licensing, on the other hand, is going to work in the opposite direction by making it more difficult for you to find somebody who can do your work because it's restricting the supply in that context. So we know from work that Bobby and I did, which provided some of the first estimates of the impact of licensing on labor supply, that when an occupation is licensed, it reduces the supply of labor in that occupation by about 17%, which is really large, right? And the question is, well, if you have fewer people doing the work, what happens? Is it that those fewer people take on more jobs, and so there's no impact on customers? Or do you get that those fewer people still do the same number of jobs, and you have the impact of that licensing being, the impact of that licensing restriction flowing over to customers? And so we're going to be able to get at that question because on this digital labor market platform, we're going to observe real-time measures of both supply and demand. Let me give you a sense of what the core research questions are going to be here. So the first is, what's the impact of licensing on the probability that a customer engaged in search on a digital platform can find at least one service provider who can provide that work for pay? That's our first research question. The second is, are these impacts persistent over time? And then the third is, are they due to licensing increasing the number of people who want to search on these platforms? So do you get a lower accept rate because you have more people looking for service providers, but they're the same number of service providers? Or is it because you have fewer service providers who can fulfill the request, given that demand on the platforms are going to be the same? And we're going to be able to disentangle those two. Let me walk you through a schematic of how the platform is going to work. So first, Ben comes to the platform. He says, look, I need to remodel my kitchen. He pops that into the platform. The platform is able to discern whether, given the task and also given the location, if that task is for a licensed task or an unlicensed task in that jurisdiction, then the platform is going to use that to generate what's going to be called a lead. And that lead is then going to be sold to service providers. And this is where the licensing restriction could potentially bind, right? So if you have a licensing restriction, there could be fewer service providers. Now, if the service providers choose to purchase that sales lead from the platform, then the customer who's searching on the platform is going to see that there is, in fact, a service provider who can provide that service. And then you'll get a lead being accepted. And that's going to be our outcome, y equals 1. If there's nobody on the platform in that geography who can provide that service, who passes the relevant requirements, then you're going to see that the search on the platform is going to be unsuccessful and the accept is going to be 0. Downstream from this process, the the individual customers and service providers can choose whether or not they're hired to set the price to negotiate. We're not going to focus on these downstream elements because they've been studied in other work. We're going to focus mostly on the impact of licensing on whether or not a customer can successfully find someone who can provide the service. So that's what we're going to focus on. That's the accept rate. To fix ideas, here are some screenshots from the platform. So in this case, I was looking for someone to help me with cleaning my house. And you can see that there were 3 people that I could find. By contrast, over here, this was a search request for some electrical work. And in this context, it said we were unable to connect you with any pros for this project at this time. This would be an accept equal to 0 on the right. That would be an accept equal to 1 on the left-hand side. So that's going to be the outcome of interest. Our approach is going to be to take novel data from an online platform that's going to have verified measures of whether or not an individual task is going to be licensed. And we're going to have 2 research designs. So the first is we're going to look at the state of New Jersey, where in 2009, there was a law passed that required people who were doing pool construction to have a license. And we're going to look at what's happening in New Jersey versus other states before and after the policy. So this is almost like a treatment control design that you would see in a clinical trial. The second is we're going to zoom into these state borders, and we're going to look at the same task, but on one side of the state border where that task requires a license, and on the other side where the task doesn't require a license. I'm going to look at differences in the accept rate in these 2 different states. Let me speak to, just give you some intuition about typically how we think about the kinds of variation in the data that could help us to understand the impact of licensing. So the first is that you can have quasi-random assignment of licenses to people within the same state. So it would be like if I were Oprah and I said, you get a license, you get a license, you get a license, you don't get a license, you don't get a license. And we look at the differences in the outcomes between the people who are randomly given a license versus those who don't, right? And that's something that was done in a paper by one of my colleagues, Kiara. And what this tells you is what's the signaling value of the license? Because there's nothing different between the people here except one person was randomly given a license, the other was not. The second kind of variation that you could have is quasi-random variation of licenses across states, where some states require a license and other states don't require a license. And in that case, when you do the comparison across states, you get what's the impact of the licensing laws themselves on the labor market outcomes. And so we're going to be focusing on this particular variation because this is going to be what's useful for trying to do the policy analysis. Because what policymakers care about ultimately is should we have licensing laws given the trade-offs rather than what's the signaling value of the license per se. What are the key findings? So the first thing is we're going to find that licensing is going to reduce the accept rate, which remembers the probability that you can find at least one person who can provide that service for paying. The second is that this reduction is going to be persistent. It's going to last at least 2 years out, maybe even longer. And then the third is that the licensing impact, the negative impact of licensing on the accept rate is going to be driven by the reduction in the labor supply, the number of people who can provide that task legally, rather than being driven by an increase in the volume of customers who are searching for that task, because now the task is licensed and ostensibly has more qualified workers. We have several contributions to the existing literature. So the first is we're going to identify successful search as a new margin along which occupational licensing can impact labor markets. The second is this is going to be one of the first papers to look at the impacts of occupational licensing that's going to exploit variation in licensing laws at the task level. And so even within the same primary work category, you can have some tasks that require a license and some tasks that don't require a license. And then the third is that we're going to demonstrate that licensing is going to produce persistent labor market shortages. Our work relates to several strands of literature. So there's a relatively new set of literature that's looking at the impact of licensing in online and offline markets. And if you see Bobby's name here mentioned many times, he is one of the leading researchers, one of the leading young researchers in this field. So Simbani's is certainly like a center of excellence with respect to that. Again, check out the article in the New York Times today, no joke. And where we're going to come in is we're going to say that there's comparatively less evidence looking at the impact of licensing on digital labor market platforms, which are an increasingly important place for economic activity. I'm now going to move on to describing the research setting and the data. The research setting is going to be the market for home services. How many of you in here have homes? Okay, awesome. So this is not unfamiliar to you, right? The kinds of tasks that we're going to see are going to be the standard, like interior painting, new cabinets, new windows, so on and so forth. We're going to observe about 500 plus distinct tasks in each of the 50 states. This market is like really huge. You have about 6 million service professionals. So this is like approximately like twice the size of the amount of people who are nurses in the United States. So this is also a very important labor market. And there are about close to 150 million homes in the United States. Crucially for our purposes, the platform is going to verify whether or not somebody has a license. And that's this bucket here. And so there's not going to be measurement error in our data. Everybody that's on our platform who can provide a task for pay with a license, that is licensed, is in fact going to have a license. This heat map shows you the variation in the data. So places that are darker are places going to be that have like more licensing restrictions. So in California, basically everything requires a license. In Texas, relatively nothing's licensed, right? And for our empirical designs and our data, the first is this research design leveraging New Jersey. In the context of New Jersey, in July of 2019, they're going to pass a law that's going to say if you're doing anything related to pools, you're going to need a license for all 17 of the 18 tasks. The only exception is going to be for cleaning or maintaining a swimming pool. You don't need a license for that. You're good. And so the data we're going to use are going to be all of the service requests or the search requests on this platform that's going to be generated over about a 5-year period from 2016 to 2021. And the method that we're going to do is an event study where we're going to look at what's happening before the policy and what happens after the policy. It's similar to what you would do with like stock returns, right? Like before there's a big earnings announcement, you look at like there's no movement in the stock price. After there's like a negative earnings announcement, the stock price drops. So it's something similar to that. The short version of this story is we're going to look at the main time of interest is going to be from July 2019 to June 2020. This is going to be kind of like the first year that the policy is enacted, and then years after that are going to be years post the policy. We're going to regress for our outcome whether or not a person searching on the platform is able to find at least one licensed person who can provide the service on these dummies for like time relative to the year in which this law is going to be passed. And so these coefficients are going to tell us whether or not there's a difference between New Jersey and all other states in the likelihood of a customer having a successful search before and after the policy. Let me show you what the figure looks like. So the way to read this figure is these negative times are going to be years before the policy, 0 and the positive times are going to be times years after the policy. So what you can see here is in the years before the policy, there's no difference between New Jersey and the other states in terms of the accept rate. That's why you see these red dots being very close to 0 and the 95% confidence intervals covering the 0 line. In the first year of the policy, immediately afterwards, you're going to see a drop of about 13 percentage points in the likelihood that somebody on the platform searching for a licensed provider can find that. And this drop is going to be persistent for the next 2 years too. And so the first headline, licensing is going to reduce the accept rate, and that reduction is going to be persistent. Right. What we can then do is instead of just looking at New Jersey versus all of the states, we can actually do New Jersey relative to each state. So almost like a pairwise comparison of New Jersey to all of these states. And what that allows us to do is to see if the overall effect that I showed you in the previous event study figure is driven by just one comparison between New Jersey and one state, or if in fact we see like similarly like negative impacts of the New Jersey law when we use each other state as a comparison, as a point of comparison. And so this is the 0 line. Negative estimates mean that licensing is going to reduce the accept rate in New Jersey relative to other states. And what you can see here is that for about 39 out of the 50 states, we're going to estimate a negative impact of licensing on the accept rate. And so this is the overall result is not just an anomaly, but in fact, we see this pattern like pretty persistently across all of these different states. To put this thank you, Ben. To put this all together, if you thought that it was a coin flip whether we would get a negative or positive point estimate, the likelihood of getting 39 out of 50 heads would actually be like pretty low. And so we think that overall these results are statistically significant to when we look at this setup. Remember that there was one category of tasks that were excluded. This was cleaning a swimming pool. And so what we could do is we could see like what was the impact of this licensing law on the accept rate for cleaning a swimming pool, which was not something that was covered by the law. And so what we can see here is that there's no impact of the licensing law on these tasks that were not covered by the licensing law. And so this is kind of a placebo or falsification test. Okay, now we're going to turn to another setting where we're going to look at the whole data for the entire US. And we're going to again regress like whether, let's see, we're going to regress whether a given task, a service a service request R for a task K in a month M, and state S is accepted or not on whether that task requires a license in that state. So our coefficient of interest is going to be beta, and we're going to control for task fixed effects, month fixed effects, and state fixed effects, so that we can have like really tight comparisons. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus us on this last column here. And so the way to read this is that when a task is licensed, it's going to reduce the accept rate by about 12 percentage points. And this is going to be looking at the same task, but comparing it across two different states. In one state where it's licensed and in the other state where it's not licensed, we're going to see in the licensed state a lower reduction, a small accept rate by about 12 percentage points. We can now separately see whether the licensing is impacting the volume of search on the platform or the volume of service providers who can accept the search. And in this first column, this is the volume of search. And we can see that the volume of search is unaffected. This is basically zero and statistically insignificant. However, the volume of accepts, which is a measure of the labor supply in the platform, is going to be dramatically reduced in the presence of licensing. And so what's really happening is licensing is reducing the labor supply on this platform. This was just using all of the data looking across all states. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to zoom in to these state borders. So for example, if we look at Rockingham County and Essex County, which are in New Hampshire and Massachusetts respectively, in Rockingham County, getting your kitchen remodeled is not going to require a license, but in Essex County it is. We can do a more tighter comparison by looking at the differences in accept rate between these adjacent counties that share a state border. Thanks, Ben. And so when we do that similar analysis, we're going to find a similar result, right? That licensing is going to reduce the accept rate by about 13%. By focusing in on these state borders, what we're able to do is to an even cleaner apples to apples comparison, because you have two local labor markets that are very similar, but in one part of it, you have a licensing along the other part you don't. And so this is an even better experiment than the previous one. Again, we can decompose this into the supply and the demand channels. What we see is that licensing has no impact on the volume of requests. So people are more likely to request something if it's licensed. And that's indicative of the fact that folks aren't looking at the licenses improving the quality of the service, but you see a reduction in the number of accepts, which suggests that there's going to be a reduction in the labor supply. Okay, what we can do now is we go and we ask service providers, what do you think would happen if a profession were licensed? Would it make it easier or harder for somebody to find a service provider, right? And what they say on average, about 26% of them actually say that licensing a profession would make it easier for customers to find somebody who can practice that trade. This is exactly the opposite of what we find from the empirical work. And this suggests that it's really important for us to do research in order to find out what the answer to questions are. Because even very knowledgeable professionals can sometimes get it wrong. In the remaining minute that I have, I want to conclude. So the first is we started off with 3 questions. What's the impact of licensing on the likelihood that a customer engaged in search on a digital platform could find somebody who can provide that work? And we find that it's going to reduce it by about 11 to 16 percentage points, which is about a 25% reduction. So this is a pretty major reduction. The second is, are these impacts persistent? Cast your mind back to the example with the pool event study. You saw the immediate drop off in the first year, and it persisted for another 2 years. And so these labor market shortages are persistent. The market is not re-equilibrating to restore this balance between supply and demand. And then finally, what we find is that licensing, the impact of licensing on the accept rate is going to be driven by a reduction in labor supply in the platform rather than an increase in labor demand. And this is going to be very important because one of the rationales for licensing is that you improve the quality of labor, and so that's going to improve customer satisfaction. But if customers aren't searching more in the presence of licensing, you're not getting that benefit in the improved service provider quality, but you're still getting the hit on the quality margin. And in the last 10 seconds that I have, we have a model that's not in the presentation. We can look at how licensing impacts customer utility. It has no impact. How to impact sperm profits on the platform. It reduces that by about 30%. How it reduces the actual platform's profits. That's around about 29%. So there are losses all around with licensing. And the last thing that I'll say is zooming all the way out. This paper is saying something even broader than just what's the impact of licensing on digital labor markets. What this paper is saying is that when you have labor market regulations that were designed for an analog offline economy, those regulations could still have a negative impact on digital labor markets and in some sense undermine some of the advantages that the technology was meant to provide. And so we have to think really critically as our labor market becomes a lot more digital, like how much of our regulations are legacy regulations rather than being adapted to the economy as it is today. So thank you very much.
So we got a couple minutes for questions.
Yes. So, I have 2 or 3 questions, but I will start the first one. So your results about the pool, that's what you base everything. So I don't know whether you can generalize
So that's not correct. So the second study is all of the data. It's not just the pool.
everything.
Yeah, so that's all of the tasks. Yeah.
And the second one, it depends also on the types of jobs, on the states. And at the end of the day, when you say it's licensed, so either it's like there is control, you control the job that your type of jobs, and the other is quality in terms of selection. So when you choose these licenses, so and then they go to the digital market where you go to the search engine. Most of these search engines become by themselves are paid. So you have to pay, for example, for Home Advisor, you are a licensee, you have to pay them.
Right.
And then the next job, you cannot get it only until through them. So that's, I have the experience of that.
Yeah.
So that's why many of the licensee actually try to avoid putting their names with Home Advisor because they take a lot of money out of them.
So on the second point, so what you're saying is that platforms are taking a lot of the surplus from the service providers. It's a toss-up, right? Because the platforms are also providing a service because they're generating leads for the service providers. The thing to keep in mind in our context is we're looking at people who are on the platform,
Yes.
but on the platform in a state where the license is required of them to be on the platform
Yeah.
and where the license is not, and we're making that comparison. So in some sense, we're keeping the platform constant, and the only thing that we're varying across these states is the license. And so we're truly able to isolate what's the impact of the licensing on the labor market outcomes within the context of the digital labor market. And that's the fundamental object that we're after, which is, does licensing impact the effectiveness of customer search on the digital labor market? Yeah. Ben, are you moderating the questions or?
I'm just mainly keeping time.
Oh, sorry.
Whoever would like to.
Okay, I think
go next.
Bobby was next and then here.
Yeah, Paul, so.
Actually, a quick question. So the main outcome is upset or not. So have you explored in on the narrative the number of purchases? I mean the number of providers who are willing to purchase a lead.
Yeah, so we have that in the model. So one of the things that we can show is that the number of service providers want to purchase the lead, the elasticity of that with the semi-elasticity of that with respect to licensing is like minus 0.2. So fewer people want to purchase the lead when it's licensed.
I think it's interesting, having lived in New Mexico and then East Coast. So in New Mexico, if you need work done, you call Mabel down the road, Mabel takes care of it, people come in, they do the work, good job, you pay them. So again, documented, undocumented. You go to Connecticut, it's licensed, but small towns, you go by the person that your parents went to, your grandparents went to. So, it's interesting. Cities, you go online, you see who's licensed, and then you contact that person. You look up what their rating is, and then. So I think it's interesting, and then I'm thinking of Florida, one of the big hurricanes. They had all these people coming down. Some of them were good workers, some of them weren't good workers. Some people got taken for their money, but, so I think this is interesting, your topic, and then licensing, non-licensing,
Yeah, thank you so much for that comment. And then I think here and then.
You said this really fast, so I wasn't sure if I heard it. And right toward the end, you said there's not a change in people looking for service, but there is in licensing does make a difference in it lowers the amount of acceptance. Great. But I thought I heard you say but there's no change in the quality. Did you say that? Because I would disagree with that.
So
I mean, I would not disagree that that happens, I would disagree that that's what you're finding, nothing different.
okay, yeah, so
But I
the-
mean, misheard you, so.
No. So I can go back to the results. So this is the measure of search, and this is the measure of accept. So this is like the supply and demand channel. There are kind of two ways that you can get at this. So the existing literature shows that there's little impact of licensing on explicit measures of quality, like the star ratings on the Uber platform or the star ratings on some other platforms as well. The way that we interpret this is we take the search to be like a revealed preference, like we take, like, if people are searching more, it must mean that they value the service more, right? If they're searching less, it means that they value the service less. So in some sense, they're voting with their feet. And so you can interpret this as kind of like an implicit valuation that customers aren't valuing the task being licensed more than it being unlicensed. Because what we're comparing is the search volume of the same task, but in a state where that task is licensed versus in a state where that task is not licensed.
So it's the quality of the search, not the quality of the work.
It's the quantity of the search. And then we take that as a measure. It would be like if you saw two restaurants and you saw that like more people are going to one than the other, and you infer that this must be like a better place because it's like the prices and everything else are the same about them. And what we're saying is we're looking at the same task, but in one state it's licensed and the other state it's not licensed. And in the state where it's licensed, you actually see a slight reduction in the number of people who are going to get that service. So if anything, that's like they might even think that the quality is slightly lower, but that's not statistically significant, so we're going to not overinterpret that. I think that there were two questions over here, so here and there.
One thing I do want to say, just so everybody knows, officially, I think the session has run its course in like 5 or 6 minutes. There's an ending speech by Mike. Obviously, you're more than welcome to stay here. And
Well, it's not
keep
gonna
talking,
start
but I just would like to know. That's fair, yeah, and as long as we keep them here, I guess we can keep those guys waiting, but I do just want to let everybody know that officially the timing is up, but otherwise you guys can continue discussing. And sorry, so Ben, I'll leave it with you.
The policy change was New Jersey, is that what you said?
So for the pool study, the policy change was in New Jersey, but then the second set of studies looks at differences in licensing laws across the state. I think I went over that part a little bit too.
So for the policy change one, could you be licensed in New Jersey before the policy change? And then, like, was there a licensing process? You just didn't have to have it?
There was no licensing requirement. You could have had a certificate.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that's not equivalent.
Well, I mean, not 100%. So
I guess the question I'm really asking is whether you have high quality people who will be licensed in those periods, who leave the digital platform because of the gains in efficiency in the offline platform or something, ignoring terms of like basically that Andy's list becomes less useful to me once information asymmetries are resolved offline. And so I stopped going there because of the point that was made earlier, which is that Andy's list is taking a cut, so I'm off.
yeah, and that would be, and in a sense, like, suppose that were to happen, like, that would be something that would capture some of the impacts of licensing on the digital market.
Oh, definitely, but I think the story would be a little bit different about, it would be very explicitly about digital platforms rather than a possibly more generalizable result of the supply restriction being.
100%, and I think that's why the results looking at the cross-state variation is really important, because that uses a broader cross-section of occupations and it's not leveraging the time series variation. So the fact that we find very similar estimates of the impact of licensing on the accept rate suggests that that this really is something about the impact of licensing in digital markets. And when you look at in percentage terms the impacts that we're finding on this digital market platform, and you compare them to the estimates that Bobby and I found just using survey data, like they're pretty similar, around about the 20% range. And so what this suggests is that if people are running into a bottleneck for finding folks on the Angie platform, if they were to go offline, they're going to run into the same like bottleneck as well too, right? Because the work that Bobby and I did was in the offline market. I'm happy to stick around and chat more with folks. I want to just release people so that way they can get away and next. And thanks to our session chairs again, and to the Foster Center.
Thank you very much.
Blair, kind of a related, Peter. sorry.
Yeah, Blair, yeah.
I heard something. Just out of curiosity, Andy's just stopped trying to do that. Did you happen to know something?
That's why I think of it, like everybody.
Who